I've spent the better part of my adult life in places most people only see on the news, places where the air smells like diesel and dust, and the rules of engagement are the only thing keeping you upright. But I never thought the toughest fight I'd ever face would be on a gravel driveway in the Texas Hill Country, defending a woman who still thinks I'm 10 years old and needs to eat more vegetables. My name's Jackson, Jackson, Miller, and after 12 years as a Navy SEAL, I thought I'd seen every brand of cowardice there is, from the shadows of the Hindu Kush to the back alleys of Southeast Asia. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepares you for the sheer, greasy entitlement of a man in a tailored suit who thinks he can bully a 93-year-old widow out of her life's work. My mom, Clara, is a force of nature, a woman who moved to this stretch of land outside of Fredericksburg back when the roads were still dirt, and the only thing higher than the summer heat was the grit it took to raise a family on a working cattle ranch. And she's lived in that same cedar plank house for 64 years, through droughts that cracked the earth and floods that took the fences, always standing tall with a thermos of sweet tea and a stubbornness that would make a mule blush. The land is ours, every square inch of the 300 acres, titles signed and sealed decades ago, taxes paid to the penny, and most importantly, we are miles away from any suburban sprawl or those cookie-cutter neighborhoods governed by the kind of people who measure the height of your grass with a ruler. So, you can imagine my confusion about 3 weeks ago when I was out by the equipment shed, elbows deep in the engine of an old John Deere that had seen better days, and I heard the crunch of tires on the limestone drive that didn't end oppos. Sound like any truck I recognized. I wiped the grease off my hands and stepped out into the blinding Texas sun to see 3 guys climbing out of a white SUV, all of them wearing these crisp, matching navy blue polos with, HOA compliance and AMP, enforcement, stenciled in aggressive silver letters across the back. I just stood there for a second, honestly wondering if I'd hallucinated the whole thing. We don't have an HOA out here. We have neighbors who live a mile apart and mind their own business. But these guys were marching up toward my mom's front porch with clipboards and iPads like they were storming the beaches, except with more arrogance and less purpose. The leader was a guy who looked like he spent too much time at the gym and not enough time in the sun, wearing those wraparound tactical shades that people wear when they want to look like they have authority but don and oppos. Actually have a badge to back it up, and before I could even get hello, out, he was pointing a finger at my mom's flower beds, these beautiful, wild patches of bluebonnets and lantana she's tended since the Nixon administration, and telling me they were violation of community uniformity standards, I remember looking at him, then looking at the endless horizon of mesquite trees and grazing Herefords, and I just had a laugh, a low, dangerous kind of laugh that usually makes people with any sense back away. But this guy, let's call him Miller, just puffed out his chest and told me that the board, had received complaints about the dilapidated state, of our north barn, and that it was obstructing the scenic view corridor, for a future development project. It was a shakedown, plain and simple, a beautifully orchestrated piece of theater designed to intimidate a senior citizen into thinking she was breaking laws she didn't even know existed, and I could see my mom standing behind the screen door, her small frame looking fragile, but her eyes as sharp as flint, and that was the moment the soldier, and me took the steering wheel from the son, I walked over, closing the distance in that way you're taught to do when you're reclaiming space, and I told them very clearly, very calmly, that they were trespassing on private property, and they had exactly 60 seconds to get back in their air-conditioned bubble and vanish before things got complicated. Miller didn't oppose. Like that, he smirked, the kind of wet, oily smirk a man who's used to bullying people who can't fight back, and he said, "Look, pal, we can do this the easy way, where you sign the compliance waiver and accept the buyout offer from our partners, or we can do it the hard way, where we lien this property for non-payment of fines until the county auctions it off from under you, your choice." He actually stepped toward the porch, reaching out as if he was going to pull the screen door open to talk to my mother directly, and that was the last mistake he ever made on our land, because my hand shot out and caught his wrist with a grip that I know, for a fact, feels like a steel vise closing around bone. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face when he realized he couldn't oppose. T move was worth more than the ranch itself, and when his two buddies tried to lung toward me, one of them actually reaching for a collapsible baton he had tucked in his belt, the muscle memory just took over, and it was over in about 4 seconds. I didn't in oppos to even have to break a sweat, just a quick pivot, a sweep of the leg, and a controlled takedown that left the tall one gasping for air in the dirt while the third guy found himself pinned against the side of the barn with my forearm against his throat, his expensive sunglasses shattered somewhere in the weeds. I've interrogated insurgents who were tougher than these guys, and once I had the third one in oppos, attention, the story started leaking out of him like a cracked pipe. They weren't into oppos, HOA. They were in, quote, private consultants, and, quote, hired by a firm called Sterling Crest Development, and their job was to create enough legal and emotional, and, quote, friction, and, quote, to make elderly landowners give up and sell for pennies on the dollar. It was a predatory, disgusting cycle of elder abuse disguised as property management, and I felt a cold, hard anger settling in my chest that I haven and oppos. T felt since my last tour in the sandbox, so I did what any responsible citizen would do. I used the heavy-duty zip ties from my toolkit to secure them to the porch railing, sat my mom down with a fresh glass of tea, and called the county sheriff, who happens to be an old high school buddy of mine. When Sheriff Miller pulled up and saw 3, and, quote, consultants, and, quote, trussed up like Thanksgiving turkeys on Claire Miller's porch, he didn't in oppos. T even asked many questions. He just looked at my body cam footage because I never go anywhere without a little insurance, and shook his head, telling me they'd been hearing rumors about a group harassing the older folks out on the county line, but nobody had been able to pin them down until now. But I knew this wasn't oppos to the end of it, because guys like the ones who hired these thugs down in oppos. T just go away when their pawns get taken off the board, they get insulted, they get aggressive, and they usually show up themselves to try and, quote, fix, and, quote, the problem with a bigger check or a bigger threat. Sure enough, 48 hours later, right about the time the sun was starting to dip and turn the sky into that bruised purple and orange that Texas does better than anywhere else, a brand new black Cadillac Escalade. The kind with the blacked out windows and the chrome that screams, and, quote, I have more money than ethics, and, quote, came crawling up the drive, and I didn't in oppos. T wait for them to knock. I was sitting on the porch in a rocking chair with a glass of water and my old service cap on, watching them come, and when the door opened, out stepped a man who looked like he'd been vacuum sealed into a $3,000 suit, a guy named Sterling. Yeah, he actually named the company after himself, who had that practiced, political smile that never quite reaches the eyes. He had 2 new, and, quote, security, and, quote, guys with him, and these wearing an oppos. T the polo shirt clowns from before. These were professionals, guys with earpieces and the kind of stance that told me they'd probably washed out of some private military contractor firm, but they were still standing on my dirt, and they were still threatening my mother in oppos as peace. Sterling started in with this smooth, rehearsed speech about, and, quote, progress, and, quote, and, in, quote, community revitalization, and, quote, and how my mother was sitting on a, and, quote, wasted asset, and, quote, that could be turned into a luxury golf resort, and he actually had the audacity to tell me that I was, and, quote, hindering her financial future, and, quote, by being difficult. I let him talk, let him dig the hole, until he finally got to the point where the mask slipped, and he told me that if I didn't into oppos to get her to sign the papers, he had enough friends in the state legislature to move the planned highway bypass right through the middle of our living room. And that's when I stood up, feeling that familiar, quiet stillness settle over me. I looked him dead in the eye and said, and, quote, you think you're the first person to try and take something that belongs to a heart? My grandfather fought his way across the Pacific to keep this land, and I've spent a decade in the dark corners of the world making sure people like you don in oppos. T get to decide who stays and who goes. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back in that oversized coffin you call a car, and you're going to drive away, or we're going to find out just how much your security detail is actually worth, end quote. One of his guards made a move, a subtle shift of his weight that signaled he was going for a concealed carry, and I didn't in oppos to even give him the chance to clear leather. I was off the porch and in his space before he could blink, a palm strike to the chest that sent him reeling back into the side of the Escalade with a thud that sounded like a bass drum, and before the second guy could react, I had him in a wrist lock that had him singing soprano in front of his boss. Sterling's face went from tanned to a sickly shade of gray as he realized that no amount of money or, in quote, connections, in quote, was going to protect him from a man who had nothing to lose and the training to back it up, especially when I pulled out my phone and showed him the live stream feed I'd been broadcasting to a secure server, including his little speech about bribing state legislators. The silence that followed was beautiful, broken only by the sound of the wind through the tall grass and the distant lowing of a cow, and I told him that the sheriff was already on his way with a warrant for attempted coercion and felony trespassing, and that my, end quote, friends, end quote, and the veterans and oppos network were very interested in his business practices. He didn't in oppos, say another word, just scrambled back in his car like a rat finding a hole, leaving his, end quote, security, end quote, to pick themselves up off the ground, and as the dust from his retreat settled, my mom stepped out onto the porch, leaned against the railing, and asked me if I thought they'd be back for the flower beds. I told her I didn't and oppos. Think we'd be seeing them again, not in this lifetime, but it makes you wonder, doesn't it, oppos? It? How many people out there don and oppos? Have a son who came home from the SEAL teams. How many grandmothers are sitting at their kitchen tables right now, clutching a pen and feeling terrified because some, end quote, official, end quote, looking person told them they had no choice. It's a sick world when the land you've bled for ISN and oppos. Even say from the people who claim to be, end quote, improving, end quote, the neighborhood, and I want to know what you guys think. Is this just the price of, end quote, progress, end quote, in modern America? Or have we reached a point where we need to start standing up a lot harder against these corporate HOAs and the vultures who run them? Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to deal with a, end quote, fake, end quote, HOA or a developer trying to push you around. Because believe me, the more we talk about these tactics, the harder it is for them to hide in the shadows. And if you're out there dealing with this right now, just remember, the, end quote, hard way, end quote, only works if you're the one who ISN and oppos. Prepared to fight back. Don and oppos. Forget to like this story and subscribe if you want to hear more about how we're keeping the ranch safe, because I have a feeling this was just the opening act, and I'm more than ready for the encore. Was I wrong to take it that far? Or is a man's home and his mother's peace worth whatever it takes to protect it? I'll be in the comments looking for your take on this one. Stay safe out there, and watch out for the guys in the polos.